Before we begin, this episode discusses abduction, sexual assault, homicide, wrongful accusation, and suicide. Please take care while listening.
Get comfortable. We have a few miles ahead of us tonight. We are pulling out of Sacramento, California, not far from Davis, a college town that was settling into Christmas in December of 1980. That winter, two 18-year-old freshmen finished helping with the children's performance at the Nutcracker. They had ice cream in the van, birthday gifts packed up, and people waiting for them at a party. It should have been an ordinary drive across town, although they never arrived. Tonight, we are remembering Sabrina Gonsalves and John Riggins. This is Midnight Miles, where every mile tells a story, and every story deserves the truth.
Before they became a case.
Before we talk about evidence, suspects, or courtrooms, I want you to meet Sabrina and John as they were before any of those things entered their lives. Sabrina Gonsalves was 18 years old and had only recently started college at the University of California. She was living with her older sister, Andrea, while she found her footing in this brand new chapter of her life. Andrea remembered a younger sister who loved children, medicine, horses, and the idea of having a family of her own someday. Sabrina hoped to become a physical therapist. Her future was not some vague someday floating far away. She could picture it. A caring profession, children, a home, more years with the people she loved. John Riggins. He was 18 too. He had grown up in Davis, so college was a new beginning in a familiar place. Friends and family remembered him as athletic, funny, and lighthearted. His bright red hair made him easy to spot, especially around the sports fields where he spent so much time. John was considering medicine, perhaps influenced in part by his father, who was an orthopedic surgeon. But at 18, the road ahead was still wide open. He had time to decide who he wanted to become. Sabrina and John had met only a few months earlier, while working for the town recreation department during the summer of 1980. According to Andrea, John was Sabrina's first boyfriend. They were young, but their relationship mattered to them. It was one of those first loves that arrives when everything in life still feels new at once. College, independence, work, plans, and the first person you begin imagining beside you in those plans. That is where I want their story to begin. Not with a nickname later given to the case, not with a crime scene, with two college freshmen, a summer job, and a first romance in a Northern California town getting ready for Christmas. On Saturday, December 20th, 1980, John and Sabrina volunteered at a youth performance of the Nutcracker at the Veterans Memorial Center in Davis. They were not on stage. They were doing the quieter work around the edges, helping the children and cleaning up after the performance ended. When they finished, they still had another celebration to reach. Andrea was turning 22, and friends and family were gathering for a surprise party. John and Sabrina were bringing ice cream and gifts. One of those gifts was a blanket. At that moment, it was only a birthday present waiting to be opened. No one could have known how important it would become.
Mile 1. The night they never reached the party.
John and Sabrina left the community center at around 8:45 that evening. Heavy fog had settled over Davis. Fog changes a familiar place. Streetlights blur at the edges. A road you have driven 100 times can suddenly feel smaller, quieter, and less certain. That night, the fog was so thick, enough that when John and Sabrina failed to arrive, an accident seemed like the most reasonable fear. Investigators later believed the couple returned near Sabrina and Andrea's apartment to collect the birthday items. A store clerk also remembered them stopping for cider, although that possible sighting has never been confirmed strongly enough to call it their final known stop. This is one of those places where the record goes quiet. We know where they had been. We know where they were going. We know some of what they carried in the van. But that exact path between those places has never been publicly reconstructed minute by minute. Back at the birthday gathering, people waited. At first, there was room for ordinary explanations. Maybe the fog slowed them down. Maybe the van had broken down. Maybe they had missed a turn or slid off the road where passing drivers could not see them. But John and Sabrina had promised to bring part of the celebration, and disappearing without a call did not feel like them. As the evening wore on, waiting became worry. Their families began searching. They checked roads, parking areas, and ditches. They looked through darkness and fog for the outline of the family van. They were searching for an accident because, as frightening as an accident would have been, it still left room for John and Sabrina to be found alive. The next day passed without a reassuring phone call. The search widened beyond Davis and into Sacramento County, following the roads east towards Folsom and the foothills. About 36 hours after John and Sabrina disappeared, the van was found roughly 30 miles east of Davis in a rural area near Folsom. Different accounts describe the exact historical location in slightly different ways, so I am not going to pretend there is a perfectly certain pin we can place on a map tonight. When investigators approached the van, there was still hope that John and Sabrina might be somewhere nearby, injured, lost, or waiting for help. The van told them something had gone terribly wrong, but it did not immediately tell them where the couple was. Searchers moved through the surrounding terrain, less than a mile away. Down in the thick brush and ravine, hidden from the road above, they found John and Sabrina. Their families had gone out looking for two young people who might need help getting home. Instead, they learned that John and Sabrina would not be coming home at all.
Mile 2. The van and the blanket.
I need to share a few difficult details here because they matter to the investigation. I will keep them brief and respectful. John and Sabrina had both been restrained with tape. Both had been killed by wounds to the neck. Evidence showed that Sabrina had been sexually assaulted. John also suffered a head injury that investigators believed may have come during a struggle, possibly while restraining or trying to protect her. The ravine was difficult to see from the road. Thick brush concealed the area below, and one later investigator believed the person who chose it may have known the terrain. That is a reasonable possibility, but it's still only that. It does not tell us exactly who selected the location, how familiar they were with it, or every step of what happened that night. The family van became the center of the investigation. Detectives processed hundreds of fingerprints. They collected clothing and other items. They documented what had been moved, opened, or left behind. The birthday gifts had reportedly been disturbed. The ice cream meant for Andrea's party had melted inside the van. And among everything investigators preserved was the blanket. Think about how ordinary that object had been only 2 nights earlier. It had been chosen as a gift, packed into the van, and carried toward a birthday party. Now it sat in an evidence file, surrounded by questions. A composite sketch was released after a suspicious man was reportedly seen in the area. Hundreds of tips came in. Detectives compared the murders with other abductions and killings across Northern California. They considered many possibilities: a repeat offender, a sexual predator, someone familiar with the region, or someone with a connection to John and Sabrina that had not yet been discovered. But the fingerprints did not lead to an identification. Witness information did not give investigators a confirmed offender. The public records we review do not establish that murder weapon was ever recovered. And the blanket, the item that would one day change the entire case, still had more to say than the technology of 1980 could ever hear. Biological stains were present, but they were not recognized during the first examination. So the case grew older. For investigators, that meant fading memories, aging evidence, and leads that became harder to follow. For families, it meant birthdays, Christmases, graduations, and ordinary days continuing to arrive without answers. Time did not make the questions disappear. It only taught everyone how long a question can remain unanswered.
Mile 3. The wrong road.
When a case remains unsolved, every promising theory can feel like the road that will finally lead somewhere. In the years after 1980, investigators compared John and Sabrina's murders with other violent crimes across the region. One name that hung heavily over Northern California was Gerald Gallego, a serial killer who abducted and murdered young women. But Gallego could not have killed John and Sabrina. He was already in jail on the night they disappeared. Years later, investigators explored a different idea. What if the people connected to Gallego had committed a similar crime to confuse responsibility for another case? This became known as the copycat theory. The theory eventually centered on 4 people: David Hunt, Celine Hunt, Richard Thompson, and Doug Lehner. In 1989, all 4 were arrested and charged with murdering John and Sabrina. They faced the possibility of the death penalty. That sounds like the moment a cold case finally found its answer. It was not. Public accounts say there was no physical evidence tying any of the 4 to John, Sabrina, or the van. The prosecution relied heavily on statements from people connected to theft, drugs, informants, and criminal circles. Doug Lehner later said investigators repeatedly pressured him to reveal knowledge or give a confession that he insisted he did not have. The 4 remained in jail as the case moved forward. Months turned into years. This part of the story deserves the same honesty as every other part. Investigators had worked through an enormous number of leads and were trying to solve the murder of 2 young people, but they also committed themselves to a theory that did not have a physical match. And 4 people lost years of their lives under the weight of a capital murder accusation. Then someone returned to the old evidence and looked again at the blanket. This time, previously overlooked biological stains were identified. DNA testing was still new territory in criminal investigations, but it could answer an immediate and very important question. Did the biological evidence match any of the 4 people already charged? It did not. The DNA excluded David Hunt, Celine Hunt, Richard Thompson, and Doug Lehner. In January of 1993, the charges were dismissed after they had spent roughly 3 years in jail. They were not a footnote. They were wrongly accused. And one of the strangest turns in this long case, the evidence that would eventually point towards Richard Hirschfield first did something just as important. It proved that the state had gone the wrong way.
Mile 4. When the blanket finally spoke.
The blanket now carried 2 very different meanings. It had been intended as a birthday gift on the last night John and Sabrina were seen alive. Years later, it helped free 4 people from a prosecution that could not honestly continue. But it still did not give investigators a name. The DNA profile belonged to someone unknown to the case. In the early 1990s, databases were nowhere near what they would later become. Investigators could preserve the profile and compare it, but only if the person who left it had a sample in a searchable system. So the case went quiet again. The dismissal was necessary. It was right. But after arrests, years of preparation, and the hope of a trial, the families were back to the same unanswered questions. Who had taken John and Sabrina? More years passed. DNA technology improved. Databases grew. Evidence collected before those systems existed could now be compared across state lines. Then, in 2002, more than 21 years after the murders, the profile from the blanket produced a hit. The name was Richard J. Hirschfield. He had never been part of the original investigation. At the time of the match, he was already in prison in Washington for sexual offenses involving children. A name after 21 years can sound like an ending. It was not. A database match is a beginning. Investigators had to confirm the science. They had to find out where Hirschfield had been in 1980 and whether he had connections to Davis, Sacramento County, the victims, the van, or the place where John and Sabrina were found. They had to trace decades of evidence storage and handling. They had to show that this biological material was connected to this crime and had not reached the blanket during some unrelated encounter. Still, for the first time in years, the road ahead had a name on it.
Mile 5. A name in Washington.
Richard Hirschfield was about 53 years old when investigators identified him through the DNA profile. His past made the match deeply concerning, but past crimes alone could not prove that he had murdered John and Sabrina. Detectives still had to build the connection one piece at a time. They learned that Hirschfield had been convicted after a violent sexual assault involving two sisters in Northern California in 1975. He was released from custody in 1980, only months before John and Sabrina were killed. At the time of the DNA hit, he was imprisoned in Washington for offenses involving two young girls. Investigators also found geographic connections. Hirschfield had friends in Davis. Reporting says those friends lived across from the residence shared by Sabrina and Andrea, near the area where authorities believe the couple may have been taken. His brother Joseph Hirschfield lived near Sacramento, and only a few miles away from the area where John and Sabrina were found. Those connections helped investigators understand how Richard might have been familiar with the area. They did not reveal the exact route of the crime, and they did not prove that he had been watching Sabrina or planning to target the couple beforehand. That distinction matters. There are things the evidence can tell us, and there are spaces it still leaves empty. The renewed investigation became enormous. The Sacramento County District Attorney's Office later described about 80 banker boxes of discovery. Other reporting described more than 200,000 pages. Imagine trying to rebuild one night from stacks of records gathered by different agencies across more than 2 decades. The original homicide investigation, the separate prosecution of the Hunt Group, laboratory reports, DNA testing, witness interviews, evidence logs, a new investigation into a man who had never appeared in the original file. Time had taken something from both sides. Some witnesses had died, other memories had faded. Evidence packaging had aged, and every handoff of the blanket could be questioned in court. The DNA gave investigators direction. It did not remove the years, the mistakes, or the work still required to bring the case before a jury.
Mile 6. Joseph's Note.
As investigators began looking into Richard Hirschfield, they contacted his brother Joseph and asked about Richard in the 1980 murders. According to later reporting, Joseph became deeply distressed after that contact. The next day, he died by suicide. He left behind a note that referred to John and Sabrina's murders. The note created questions investigators would never be able to ask him face to face. Joseph wrote that he had been present and believed his own DNA would be found. He also identified Richard as the person responsible. But when the case reached trial, the jury did not hear the note in full. The court allowed only a redacted portion. Jurors heard language supporting Joseph's claim that he had been there and expected his DNA to be found. They did not hear the clearest line accusing Richard, and they did not hear every statement Joseph made about his own responsibility. That meant the same note could be used to tell two very different stories. Prosecutors could argue that Joseph's reaction and his claim of being present supported a connection between the brothers and the crime. The defense could argue that Joseph, who was no longer alive to answer questions, may have been the killer or the person most responsible. Public reporting does not describe Joseph's DNA being identified in the van evidence. Why he believed it would be found remains unknown. We also do not know what his exact role was, if he had one, in the abduction, assault, killings, transport, or disposal. So even after investigators found Richard's DNA, this case did not become neat or simple. One brother's biological profile was on the blanket. The other brother claimed he had been present, then died before investigators could fully question him. The note opened a door. It did not illuminate everything behind it.
Mile 7. 32 years later.
Richard Hirschfield was brought into the California case while already incarcerated. Then came years of hearings, motions, delays, and the slow work of preparing an old case for a modern courtroom. A preliminary hearing was held in 2007. The trial finally began in Sacramento County Superior Court in September of 2012. Nearly 32 years had passed since John and Sabrina left the community center. The prosecution's case centered on the DNA and what it meant in context. The profile from semen on the blanket matched Hirschfield. CBS reported that Sabrina's DNA appeared in the mixture with his, which prosecutors used to argue that the evidence was connected to the assault rather than some innocent unrelated contact with the blanket or van. Prosecutors also presented Hirschfield's connections to Davis and Sacramento County, Joseph's reaction and redacted note, and the testimony about Hirschfield's 1975 sexual offense that the judge allowed for a specific legal purpose. The defense did not have to identify another killer. Its job was to show the jury that there was reasonable doubt. Defense attorneys argued that Hirschfield's biological material could have been deposited at another time. They questioned the age and condition of the evidence, packaging, and raised the possibility of transfer or contamination. They reminded the jury that the investigation had already gone badly wrong once, when 4 people were charged and held for years before DNA excluded them. They also pointed towards Joseph. Because the jurors did not hear the line in which Joseph directly accused Richard, the redacted note left the defense room to argue that Joseph may have been the killer or the more responsible participant. The jury had to decide whether decades of age and handling made the biological evidence unreliable, or whether the location and mixture of the DNA tied Richard Hirschfield to the assault and murders beyond a reasonable doubt. Then, on November 5, 2012, after less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found Richard Hirschfield guilty of murdering John Riggins and Sabrina Gonsalves. A separate penalty phase followed. On December 6, the jury unanimously recommended a death sentence. Judge Michael Sweet formally imposed that sentence on January 25, 2013. Hirschfield remained under that sentence for the rest of his life. On December 16, 2024, he died at a California medical facility at the age of 75. The state reported an initial natural cause determination. That is where his record ends. It is not where John and Sabrina's story should end.
Remembering John and Sabrina.
A guilty verdict can answer a legal question. It cannot restore the life that existed before the question had to be asked. It could not give Sabrina the career in physical therapy she had imagined. It could not give her the children she had hoped to have, or more afternoons around horses with her sister. It could not give John the years he should have had to choose his own path, whether that became medicine or something entirely different. It could not let his parents and younger siblings watch the funny, red-haired athlete grow older. The verdict also could not return the years taken from the 4 people who were wrongly charged, or erase what happened when investigators followed the wrong theory for too long. And there are questions the trial did not settle. We still don't know exactly what Joseph Hirschfield did, why he believed his DNA would be found, or every step of how John and Sabrina were taken from Davis and brought east into Sacramento County. But this case leaves us with something important. Evidence matters even when it cannot speak yet. Preserving it matters. Looking at it again matters. Following it when it points towards someone new matters. And when it proves that people already accused are innocent, having the courage to turn around matters too. At UC Davis, near Putaw Creek Lodge, a tree and plaque honors Sabrina Gonsalves and John Riggins. The memorial does not call them evidence. It does not call them a cold case. It does not reduce them to the name of the man convicted of taking their lives. It gives their names. And after all these years, that feels like the right place for us to finish tonight. Sabrina was 18. She loved children, horses, medicine, and the family she hoped to build. John was 18. He was funny, athletic, easy to recognize by his bright red hair, and still deciding where life might take him. They were on their way to a birthday party with ice cream, gifts, and every reason to believe there would be another Christmas after this one. Tonight, we remember Sabrina Gonsalves and John Riggins. Thank you for writing with me.